Hi guys, I'm going to be discussing Johnson's chapter 9 today. It's called A Social Life and starts with Jordan, who was assigned to work with a child who had a mild intellectual disability. So Jordan goes on to observe that the child's siblings are also exhibiting similar tendencies to the child he was working with. This scenario led to a revelation from Jordan where he realized that the child's parents created a family culture that was counterproductive to the child's success in certain areas. This introduced the concept of culture and why it's so important. Excuse me. The chapter goes into culture and discusses contingencies and how our behavior is constrained by things like our senses, which determine a lot of what we do. The chapter discusses culture and how it has an effect on learning. Our awareness of our own behavior and human nature itself come from others, and this awareness and perspective develops over time throughout a person's life. Thinking through problems and learning about topics can impact this view. There are lots of things that can impact this view and this perspective throughout time. After the book discusses culture, it talked about natural selection. So it first talked about B.F. Skinner and 3 ways that natural selection underlies behavior, all of which are contingencies. So we're learning a lot about contingencies this week, and that's a lot of Chapter 9. The first contingency is of survival and is responsible for natural selection. Next, we have contingencies of reinforcement, as well as contingencies that are maintained by social involvement. Now, these are more particular and specific kinds of contingencies of reinforcement, where culture and cultural norms come into play to impact behavior. But in general, the contingencies of reinforcement is this bigger category, whereas the contingencies that are maintained by social involvement is the smaller category of this. Johntson also then discussed phylogeny and ontogeny. So we discussed a lot of this in class, but in this specific chapter, these 2 concepts are related to contingencies. So phylogenetic contingencies refer to ones that happened in a species' environmental history in the past, whereas when we talk about ontogeny related to contingencies, we're talking about the interactions between an individual and the individual's environment during the actual life of the individual. So these 2 things are asking about past tense versus present tense and seeing the things that have impacted the group or species in general and timing, and how that relates to contingencies. So after discussing that, Johntson distinguished between proximate and ultimate reinforcers, explaining that proximate reinforcers have socially mediated consequences, like when we behave in other ways that people do like versus ways that people don't like. Maybe they will react to us in certain ways. So these socially mediated consequences reinforce us. If we do something well, someone reinforces us. If we do something incorrectly, maybe they'll tell us that they don't like it, and then that's how these contingencies exist. The concept of proximate reinforcers contrasts or compares with ultimate reinforcers, which are related to long-term health, longevity, reproductive things like that in general. So these are similar but not the same. But when we go to look deeper into the reading on page 171, the book then begins to go into this broader concept. It discusses the possibilities of behavioral science in general and suggests that it can help create recommendations for things like government, the food industry, and general diet practice. So there are many different contingencies discussed in the chapter, not just these, but also monetary contingencies, which influence things that we eat, because if you think about it, we buy what we can afford. So we are eating basically based on this monetary contingency. The things that we're willing to purchase also are related to this. So maybe somebody who has a lot more money is likely to eat something like fish or something that is a little bit more expensive, whereas people who have to rely on this certain amount of money, or the contingency is how much money they have, then that would change what people are eating. Even though money isn't related directly to food and the things that we eat or diet, it is evidently directly related based on these contingencies, or indirectly related based on these contingencies. The book also talks about counter control, which is when one group reacts to control from another. So if you think about, in general, people establishing control, there's going to be somebody else reacting to that control. So maybe it's a group, maybe it's an individual, maybe it's a species, but counter control is when one group reacts to control from another group or individual. The concept of, cultural engineering is introduced as a way to adapt the environment throughout this chapter. So the book talks about different ways to do this, to culturally engineer our environment, or culturally, we're engineering the things around us. The different ways that we can do this involve things like engineering changes in the workplace and workplace culture. So on page 175, they're discussing things that cultural engineering can do. And if we think about how important it is to take into account the environment and adapt the environment, then this definitely plays a role and ties back into the beginning of the chapter, where we had Jordan, who worked with a child with an intellectual disability who had an issue with his family and his culture, and then these things related to how well he did and how well he thrived based on his environment. So we're now talking about cultural engineering, which is a way that we can act on this environment and we can adapt the environment, right? Because none of this information is important unless we can do something about it. What's the point of knowledge if not to change what we're doing in our practices to help people? So after talking about cultural engineering, the book goes in to discuss the survival aspect of this, saying that cultural practices are directly related to our survival, which makes sense. The reason that we are alive today is because we have many different people to help us, teach us skills. Our parents watch out for us. They teach us things. But most importantly, the biggest concept that this book went into that I thought was really interesting was that all of these things I've discussed, all of these cultural practices don't just have one use. There's no single benefit of any cultural practice that's been discussed, but instead are sustained over time because they have multiple benefits. Anything in any culture, or just culture in general, exists because it has multiple benefits. So this leads right into the question that I want to ask, which is, can you think of a cultural practice that is sustained over time because it has multiple benefits? That's question number one. And question number two is, can you think of a cultural practice that seems harmful but is still around today? And why might that be? Is it being reinforced? Does it have multiple benefits in addition to the drawbacks that sustain it and keep that practice in place and in existence? I'm curious about your guys' thoughts, and thank you for listening to this chapter. I hope that you found it interesting and have some cool things to say, and I will continue to discuss more with you later.